As good as we're going to get?
That's great, thank you very much.
Okay, so great, so thank you for that. So a few other health and safety issues, beware of the cables. When it comes to the panel, please can we ask everyone to be considerate to different points of view and polite in their questions and responses. There may be filming of this talk. The intention is that we only film the speaker, so please try and keep your distance if you really don't want to be caught in the shot inadvertently. So the structure of the next up till 2 o'clock is that it's mostly a Q&A session. I'll be asking Freya to introduce the first question in a minute. I'll then give each of the panel, the 7 panellists, an opportunity to introduce themselves, speak about their interests, and respond to Freya's question. After we've done that, I've got a list of questions that have been sent to the organisers in advance. I'll be asking some of those questions and asking the audience as well for their questions to the panel. Okay, so I hope that's clear. I'm going to invite Freya to ask the first question and then we'll move on to the panel.
So my question for the panel is, when I delivered this talk to my class at school, most people hadn't heard about the climate crisis we were in. How would you suggest we spread the news and inform people of the truth of what's coming?
So thank you very much, Freya. I hope you all got the question there. So I'll invite the panel from left to right to introduce themselves and answer the question.
Hi, my name's Sally. I think it's a really difficult thing to do because I think at the end of the day we're all individual advocates, and actually I think it's our responsibility to spread the message. I think with our current state of politics and what's going on in Whitehall, and the only advocates we have now are ourselves. So I think if everyone can use this event to empower themselves with actually this is a crisis, this is not a joke, then we are the strongest advocates, and it's our responsibility to educate each other.
Can the panel just introduce themselves as well? Just the names and the sort of affiliation, where they come from and what they represent. Thanks.
Oh, sure. So obviously I'm Sally again. So I'm an engineer and I work with high voltage and electric and hybrid vehicles.
Hi, my name's Lucie. I run EcoBricks UK. I also run a New Forest Aquaponics, which is a community interest company in the New Forest. And in answer to the question, I think the first thing we have to do is be honest to ourselves and be honest with the changes that we are making and make sure our impact is the least it can be, and then you start talking to everybody.
Hi, I'm Ken Neal. I'm a local building design environmental consultant. I've designed 3 houses to save 80% on their fuel bills. I also build in earth, and I help build the Sammy the Snake in the school playground.
I'm Richard Benyon. I'm the local MP, after a fashion, after this week. And I am the former Environment Minister, and I consider myself, as well as being a politician, an environmental campaigner. I'm not embarrassed about that. And in answer to your question, Freya, I think you're doing a pretty good job, and I think you should be very proud of it. And I think that a number of different organisations are doing a great job. But you know, at this amazing event, and all you people here, you've bought into this. You're here because you want to commit yourselves and find out new ideas about how you can do your own bit, as well as encouraging people like me to encourage governments to do more. But there are people who aren't here, who are broadly sympathetic. We've got to carry them with us. We've got to inform them. And we've got to do that in a way that doesn't irritate or frustrate them, but yes, we can use language that scares them at times, and yes, we can encourage the laws and regulations to be changed, which forces people to change the way they live. But ultimately, we want them on side. We want them to be at this event next year, them to be committed. And that means working with the grain of public opinion.
Thank you. I'm Brian Hoskins. Yep. I'm Brian Hoskins. I've been a professor of meteorology at the University of Reading for many years, and I've also director and now chair of an institute at Imperial College, which is a climate institute. And I gave my first public talk on climate change in 1985 So I've been trying for a long time to tell people about this issue. It's actually not my research, directly my research area, but it soon became to me very clear that this was such an important issue that we had to go out there and tell people. And I've been trying to do that in my career, and I've also taken part in other things that are doing that. For instance, the Grantham Institute at Imperial, then at all levels we have this approaching people, approaching government, telling government what we think should be happening, approaching industries and approaching communities and people. And we need different techniques for all these and different ways of doing it, and every possible media we can use, we need to do that. So I can only give 20 public talks a year, but we have to get, and that reaches a certain number of people. But hopefully, as Richard was saying, if all the people in those 20 talks go out and take the message and talk to others, then that's the way we can really spread it. Because that's the only way things will happen at the top, is if really there's this bubbling up from the bottom. And that's been the amazing thing about the children's strike and also Extinction Rebellion, is really that bubbling up, and it's carried everyone with it. And that's important that we do that.
My name's Carolyne Culver. I'm very proud to say that I'm the council ward member for this area. Really proud to have Hampstead Norreys within my ward, and I think today's event is fantastic, so thank you very much to everyone. And as other speakers have said, it's a really good way of spreading the word. I think we, in the Green Party, we've supported the climate strikers. We did a petition to the local council to call for a climate emergency earlier this year, which has now been passed, which is fantastic. And during the course of doing that petition, we were able to talk to a lot of people in the street and on the doorsteps. And also during the local election campaign in May, I spoke to many people who were concerned about the green bin charge and plastic recycling and so on. So those sorts of conversations showed me that a lot more people are actually concerned about these issues than what you would believe if you just read the mainstream press, for example. And I think also talking to family and friends is really important. Sometimes we avoid conversations with people because we think they might not be interested, or it might be a bit difficult or controversial, but I think we just need to keep on having those conversations with people. And ultimately we need political change as well, because we need to change the system as well as just what happens at a local level. So hopefully that's something that myself and colleagues like Richard are able to do through the political system.
I'm Lawrence Woodward. I was the co-founder and director for over 30 years of a thing called Elm Farm Research Centre. It's an organic research centre. I started farming organically in 1975, and we created our research centre because of the question, how do we feed ourselves when the oil runs out? Those of you old enough to remember the 70s know we had lots of oil crisis, 3-day week and so on. So oil was a big issue then. And we kind of developed the question into how do we feed ourselves on a world of finite and diminishing resources. And over the years, through research and through communication, we tried to get that concern and message across, and we failed dismally. There's a simple answer to how we deal with this in a world of finite and diminishing resources, is we don't, we can't. We cannot deal with it while we continue to live a lifestyle and run businesses in the way that we do. It's simply not possible. So in terms of, in answer to Freya's question, how do we spread the message? First of all, is what is the message? It's all very well governments making declarations of we have a climate emergency. What are they going to do about it? As Greta said in the email, declarations are fine. What are we going to do about it? And nobody's owning up to it. We're not getting across the message that we have to fundamentally change how we live our lives and organise our society. Getting that message across is not easy, because there's not one simple message. There's different messages to different generations. What I say to people of my generation, as Greta Thunberg said, is actually we've stolen our children's future. The number of conversations I have which get very tetchy when I say to people, you tell me you'll do anything for your grandchildren and children, but actually you don't change your lifestyle. So what's that make you? A liar, hypocrite, whatever? Well, that message doesn't go down very well. But unless people who are my generation start listening to that message, nothing will change, because the power won't change. As far as children are concerned, it's very difficult. I asked this question to my grandkids who are at school in London, and they love the school strikes. And I thought, okay, this is just a way of getting out of school. But amazingly, they told me in detail about climate crisis. They knew and they were interested. For them to maintain that interest means their teachers have got to maintain the interest. So the local authorities, the people who run the schools, have got to support the teachers who are willing to support that ongoing message. Because it's not just one message and it's not just for one time, it's an ongoing thing. In terms of how we do it, talking, communication, talking to everybody and so on, not ducking it is important. I disagree with Richard. We cannot afford to go along with the grain of public opinion. We have to change the grain of public opinion. That means going against it.
So thank you very much. I think some quite profound statements there already. Is Freya still around? Freya, did that answer your question? And would you like to shout out any follow-up questions before we move on? Are you happy with the responses you heard there? Okay. So let me just open it to the audience for a minute. Based on what you've heard so far, does anybody want to respond or ask a further question based on this? I might have to run around with this microphone. Stop. That's as far as it goes.
Isn't the way to spread the message better to add this to the national curriculum so that children can learn about it at school and then pass that message up to their parents so their parents see that this is a major problem for them?
Thank you. So the question there was, should it be on the national curriculum? Who'd like to have a go?
Yeah, so there's quite a lot of stuff in the national curriculum already about climate, obviously adverse effects. The children learn all about, the R's. My 8-year-old's here somewhere, looks like the Incredible Hulk. Well, that's the face makeup, not the day that he's having. The children are doing a huge amount. But what we have to remember is we have an education system that's also flawed because we're teaching a post-industrial education system. We don't allow that creativity and that flexibility within our school system for children to be able to explore these subject matters, more. It's like tick the bullet points, write the right exam question. And I think it all comes back to, and I'm quite glad you're an MP, because it all comes back to the fact that from the top down, our system no longer works for the society that we need. And that's what we have to do. We have to uprise from the bottom and push out this lot and sort out society as it needs to be sorted out. And this is not just us. This is every country, every citizen around the world. And we have to listen to the children, but also, as the gentleman rightly said, it's our responsibility as adults to help push them forwards. They've all got brilliant ideas, and they are advocates for their future. We've messed it up. The reality is, as Obama said, is we're the first generation to be aware of the problem, and we'll be the last generation that could basically solve it and do something about it. So we have to act now. So yes, the curriculum does have stuff, but the curriculum and education itself is flawed. Every part of our society is flawed, sadly.
Thank you. Anybody else?
The big problem we've got is we need to have less. If we have less, it puts the economy into recession. The banking system can't take us having less, so we need to change the banking system. We cannot carry on paying interest or charging interest because that requires growth, and growth is not what we need now.
I don't find a school. I go to schools all the time across West Berkshire, and I do not find a school where they are not talking about this, teaching about it, using all different aspects of the curriculum as a platform on which to debate this. So, and much of it is coming from the kids themselves, as you've heard. And so I'm actually quite positive about what schools are doing. If we want to have a debate about whether we should have economic growth or not, that is a very big one. I would just draw your attention to the fact that the countries with the worst environmental records, where the most catastrophic environmental degradation is happening, are countries that have crashed their economy and have gone into freefall. And you only have to go and look at what's happening in Venezuela today to see what an absolute disaster. So don't listen to a politician. Listen to sensible green economists who say that we can do this without living in sackcloth and ashes and going, I'm exaggerating, without putting ourselves in severe poverty. We can do this sensibly. but we have to do it fast and we have to make a difference. You want to be very wary of those who try and say that we've got to turn our economy into reverse. We can do this, and it is through growth and sensible growth and sustainable growth that we can achieve this.
Perhaps I can just follow on from that. The UK has now agreed to a zero greenhouse gas target by 2050. That is an amazing target. We think it can be done through the growth in the new technologies and through the willingness of people to do this. And so it's sort of within the system, but it is a transformation of that system, but not as a revolution, but as a transformation. And we can do that, and I'm a great believer we can do that. We can lead the world in doing that. In fact, we only have a place in the industries of the future in the world if we do lead that.
I think we're sort of veering away from the questions.
Okay, so I'll follow on. Actually, I'll follow myself if you don't mind. So there's a suggestion there that continuous economic growth is still sustainable. I think that's quite controversial, and some of the questions I've had do challenge that. And there's a bunch of targets that the government's going to have to achieve in order to reach the aspirations, and we don't seem to be on the right track so far. You know, a lot of the things that we see as householders in terms of feed-in tariffs for solar or renewable heat, or we're talking grant for low-emission cars, all these things are going backwards. And I'd like to sort of put it to the panel, what are the policy changes that really have to happen to make sure that this becomes embedded in everybody's life, so that, you know, houses are built to the best building standards, they have solar panels, that renewable energy is built into the developments that we have going forwards, because we need such a profound change to where we are today, and it just doesn't seem to be that the policies that are in place are actually making the difference that the Committee on Climate Change certainly wished to achieve a few years ago. In fact, in the most recent review, I think 15 out of the 18 key indicators from the Committee on Climate Change, none of them have been met. So it's not going in the right direction. So I was wondering if anybody would like to try to come back on that.
It all comes down to economics again, doesn't it? Because at the end of the day, those changes mean less in the coffers at number 10. So, it's all about consumerism. We are pushed all the time to consume because that equates in revenue and profits, etc. We have to change the way we think, and we have to change the way that we act. There's a question later on about Heathrow and the Heathrow expansion, and what the reality is of the. We talk about target change, for Kyoto and Paris, and what the maths are around carbon and our carbon targets. They don't include aviation, and aviation is 55% of that if you took it into account. So, there are lots fundamentally wrong about those policies. There's lots fundamentally wrong about where the government is investing in UKRI and the industrial strategies and the PLCs they're giving that money to. We need to really invest. There is a strong economic future in alternatives and alternatives to consumption. And, as an engineer and sort of leading that pathway in an engineering perspective, we have some of the best engineers in the world. We can come up with the solutions to solve these problems, but not if those at the top keep investing it in big PLCs and sell off parts of what makes us great.
Europe and the US live a 3 to 5 planet lifestyle. We're about a third of the world's population. There's 2/3 of the world's population want some of what we've got. Obviously, they can't have it, and because we've only got the one planet to live on. So we in the West, and especially US and Australia, who are on a 5-planet lifestyle, are going to have less in the future. It's even David Cameron, before an election, 2010 I think it was, said that we were at our happiest in the 50s because we had less, but we were quite happy in ourselves, and satisfaction has lowered as we've been prompted to have more and more. There's an interesting statistic came out. If we all kept our mobile phones for 3 months longer, we could save the carbon emissions of Singapore for a year. But we've got this continual pressure to buy more and more and more, just to keep growth going. Sustainable growth. In nature, growth either goes up to a peak and then levels off, or growth goes up to a peak and then it dies off. It doesn't keep going up and up. And the realities of exponential growth are that there's a doubling time. If you have a 3% growth rate, you have to double everything you've ever produced every 23 years. You divide the growth rate into 70 and that gives you doubling time. So China has been growing at 10%. They've doubled everything they've ever used in 10 years. So how is that going to be sustained?
When I talk to sixth forms, I ask them to put their hands up if they think global poverty has increased in the last 40 years, and nearly all of them put their hands up. And I say, no, I'm sorry, it's actually by the UN calculation of what is poverty, it has fallen by 85%. It's a fantastic story. We have reduced poverty by 85% in 40 years. And that is a little bit of governments doing the right thing, a little bit of overseas development aid, but massively the kind of globalised companies that you sometimes hear criticised, investing in countries, giving people a future. And the same thing can happen in climate science. And if I can extol you to do one thing, to read a book called Climate of Hope by the environmental campaigner Carl Pope and Mike Bloomberg, who is the mayor of New York. And in it they say that while the Paris Agreement is fantastic, is a wonderful milestone in our journey towards solving this problem, what really will make a difference is when city mayors, chief executives of large companies and investors increasingly look at climate change not as a political issue, but as a financial and economic one, and see there are gains to be made by averting the problem and having a fully functioning climate change ethos in how they manage their businesses, how they run their cities, and how they engineer vast quantities of funds to solve these problems. And that is what we have to do, as well as all this wonderful work we're seeing here today. We want to mobilise the global economy to solve this problem.
If I can return to the Climate Change Committee and whether we're meeting our targets. I was on the Climate Change Committee for 10 years, and it became very clear to us that this needed to be handled from the centre of government. Instead, it was handled by individual departments, and only one or two of those took any notice of it. So if you take the Department of Transport, they thought it was nothing to do with them, any of the climate change issues. No reaction whatsoever. DCLG buildings, no, we can go on putting up rubbish. And it was the fact that most of the departments in Whitehall ignored the Climate Change Act and the policies that were required. So that those policies were available. Like Richard, I don't think we necessarily need a revolution. What we need is a focus on this problem, and that has to be at the centre of all government decisions, not just one department here and others ignoring it. That's the way forward. We can do it, and that was the essence of my lecture just now. It's there to be taken, but it needs people not to ignore the issue. And the Secretary of State for the department must be told centrally by government that this is part of it. It has to be in Downing Street that this is being controlled, not in BS or whatever. Every department has to be involved. Every policy they have has to be looked at through the lens of climate change.
I think some of the practical things we can do, I'm on the planning committee at the council. We've got something called Planning Advisory Group where we talk about changing policies. It's an incredibly complex issue, and I know that the government did have certain energy standards for houses which they then went back on, But there is something called standard assessment procedure where councils can set their own percentage for how sustainable houses are in terms of their energy use. So we're constantly looking for ways that we can improve the building regulations locally to try and encourage developers to do more to make their homes more sustainable. So that's one practical thing. I think another policy would be to oppose expansion of Heathrow. We submitted a petition to the local council on Thursday evening. About 700 or 800 people in West Berkshire said that they didn't think it was compatible with reducing carbon emissions to expand Heathrow. And unfortunately this week the council has released a paper saying that they do want to continue supporting Heathrow expansion as long as it's carbon neutral. So I don't know how you can achieve that unless you build a runway and then you don't actually put any planes on it. So that is something that we will continue to oppose. Things like electric cars. So the government had various subsidies for people for electric cars. I know some of them were cut and for hybrids they were scrapped. If we could reverse those decisions, that would help. And Richard made a very valid point about needing to look to business and so on. If you could incentivise companies to use other materials apart from plastics, if it was within their interests financially, if it was cheaper or easier, they would do it. So, and it's only governments who can make sure that that happens. So if they can find ways of incentivising those businesses, you could get rid of things like plastics a lot quicker than if it's just up to us recycling locally.
I think first of all, I think we have to stop being obsessed totally by the question of carbon, because the issue is not just carbon. We use the term carbon as a shorthand for a range of other greenhouse gases, and it's the collection that's the issue. So if we talk about carbon, it's a shorthand that leads us into the cul-de-sac, in my view. The second point is that if we're looking at any business policy or government policy, if we just constantly deal with the end of pipe, the emissions, we have a limited range of options, policy options and technical options. Well, our real problem is the intensity of our consumption of a range of resources. So, for example, electric cars that require battery technology, the components, the things that go into batteries have got a 30-year life. Lithium has got a 30-year life in terms of its availability for digging out of the ground. And the process of pulling it out of the ground is an environmental disaster as it stands at the moment. So we do have to look more broadly. And I think, although I think the work of the Climate Change Committee is excellent, and their policies, as you say, Sir Brian, about transformation are critically important. But I think there's a bit of sleight of hand and smokes and mirrors in that a lot of the targets are based on the idea of carbon sequestration or taking carbon out of the atmosphere by technologies that we don't yet have. And I think we're resting too much on that technical gamble. And for me, the critical thing is actually the intensity of the stuff that goes in, and that is essentially to do with fossil fuel use, petrochemicals, and the energy that we pull out from the ground. That drives our economy, and we have to change that. Whatever we do with carbon sequestration, whatever we do with end-of-pipe emissions, we must not lose the importance and the priority of dealing with the fact of stopping taking fossil fuel out of the ground in its various forms. We have to de-intensify. We have to alter the driver for our economy. Now, whether that's a revolution or a transformation, I don't know. Let's say it's a transformation. But I do agree here with Sir Brian that those policies, a number of the policies that can make transformation, have been around for a while. They've been around. The critical thing is government haven't taken them seriously. It's not at the heart of government. Economic growth is at the heart of the government. Managing the fiscal system at the heart of government. Dealing with the intensity of production and the consequences of climate collapse should be at the heart of government. That should be driving it. We should have a budget statement as well as a financial statement on this issue. And those policies of transformation should be put in place. So that's the first thing. But how do we manage business? There's a very good article this week by Professor Ian Boyd, who until recently was the Chief Scientist of the Department of Environment. And he made the point, it's stuff. We consume too much stuff. But he made the point, which I think Richard's saying, is business can drive this. Well, the thing we have to remember about business, how policies deal with business, is three major things: taxation, incentive, and regulation. All our political policies, our fiscal policies, are based on giving incentives. We're talking about deregulation everywhere, right across the board. Actually, we need more regulation, and we need a different taxation system that makes incentives work. And that has to come from government, because actually, however good you can do at local authority level in terms of building regulations and so on, it's nothing if the right frameworks are not supplied by policy in government on taxation, incentives, and critically regulation. And that will drive industry in the direction that we want.
Thank you to the panel. One of the questions I had in advance has been touched on by a couple of the panellists, which is to do with Heathrow, which has been quite topical recently. And I think before I ask the panel their views on Heathrow, I think it'd be quite interesting to see what do the audience think in true question time style. So, would you like to raise your hand if you support the Heathrow expansion? So I can count a handful, literally, a handful of hands. I say it literally, a handful. And if you're opposed to the Heathrow expansion, that's really interesting. I mean, it's like, 90% of this audience. I mean, this audience is going to be a bit climate aware, so it's not representative of the population, but that's fascinating. So, to the panel, what do you think? Should we be opposed to Heathrow expansion? I think, Sal, you touched on it earlier, but if you can just say it briefly and then let everybody have a chance.
So I dug out a few facts about Heathrow. So one, Heathrow is apparently not at full capacity. There is no safety zone around the proposed third runway. The congestion around Heathrow is already dire. Each flight that goes out of Heathrow is less than 66% full. That means 1 in 3 flights, for example, to New York is already empty. We need to address travel. Most of the business travel that goes out of Heathrow could be readdressed using technology. Then we get on to the scary facts. Quickly facts. So I think people deserve to know facts. It's not about yes or no, because the government's pushing it. So 9 people die daily from air pollution in London alone. And that's due to do with not carbon, but as the gentleman said, nitrogen dioxide is a big issue. 12,000 people from 190 businesses will lose their jobs. 783 homes will be demolished. So, like we said earlier about emissions, so the UK is allowed 160 million tonnes of CO2 allowance a year. Heathrow would account for 55% of that if the Kyoto Agreement included CO2. So the reality check is, if aviation continues the way it is unchecked by 2037, the industry will be responsible for all of the carbon that the UK is allowed to emit. Failure to prevent climate change will see at least 1 billion people suffer with water shortages, and 40% of species will become extinct. And sea levels will rise, and that would threaten Heathrow's new terminal, because it would be underwater.
So on a personal level, when I was 5, I flew to Australia to see my older brother. I had no choice in it. When I came back, I was asked to give a talk to my class about how exciting it was to be on an aeroplane. My son, at the age of 8, gets questioned why he's never been on an aeroplane. Please, could we all change our attitude to our right to fly? Because it is not a human right that keeps us alive.
I did some research for an essay at CAT on the MSc that I did there, and the number of people who actually fly is probably 20 or 30% of the population. At the moment, it's supposedly an average of 80%, but that number is made up of people, probably business people, who make 20 or 30 flights a year. And that's impinging on the rest of us. So, as the lady said, business has got all sorts of ways that they can contact people. Perhaps they should start.
Okay, I'm in favour of expansion of Heathrow, and I'm very excited to represent a part of the high-tech Thames Valley economy. I think, as Brian says in his lecture earlier, that transport is the big laggard in terms of cleaning up and decarbonising. And I think the new aeroplanes are much cleaner. And I think that there's a company in Newbury called Rock Technologies that does a lot of the Internet of Things. They are, for example, working with Heathrow to try and limit the carbon emissions from aircraft on the ground. There is much more that can be done about cleaning up aircraft in the skies. And I think that we have to be very careful about saying a blanket reason that we don't want another runway at Heathrow, and not thinking about all the implications of this, and not thinking about our own lives. And I talk about the environment and climate change the whole time, but I fly. I rejoice that air travel has brought the world closer together, that people whose families live in Australia can go and see each other. And these are all marvellous things about making a better, safer, more connected world. But there are huge things that we can do to change it. We can use video conferencing, loads of different ways of conducting our lives without flying, and we should be really careful about doing it. We should be able to offset better. I've been looking at offsetting my travel. I have a job with NATO, which means that I have to travel a bit through work, and I'm a bit suspicious, frankly, of some of the offsetting websites I've looked at. I think there's a bit of greenwash going on there. I think we've got to make it easier for people to reduce the impact of our flying, but I want to keep my constituency in the Thames Valley benefiting from the wonderful inflow of investment that we get from a place like Heathrow.
Let me start with a slightly different slant, which is the science of climate change and aviation. There's the direct emissions of carbon dioxide, but there's the biggest other impact is actually the contrails, the condensation trails you see in the sky, which actually have an impact which can be quite large. But if we stopped aviation, they would disappear very quickly. And there's always been a question of how much you should multiply the CO2 by to get the full impact of aviation. But I don't think there'll ever be an agreement on that, so maybe the number one is we'll deal with is just CO2. I was on the Climate Change Committee when we were thinking about the targets, etc., and the recommendation which government accepted was that uniquely in the world, the UK would include aviation in its target. No one else is doing that, international aviation. So we actually have that in our 80% reduction target initially, the target we had before. Aviation was actually in that. And part of that was that we said to government, well, there may be increases in efficiency of aviation, but aviation should not emit any more CO2 than it has in the past. And the implication of that is that we already have enough slots in southern England for aviation, and if Heathrow expands, it means the regional airports will not be able to fill their slots.
Thank you. Personally, I've given up flying. I haven't flown for about 18 months now, and I've signed the Flight Free 2020 pledge, which is online if you haven't seen it. And I would encourage everyone to sign up to that. But I do recognise that some people have relatives on the other side of the world, and you wouldn't want to be in a situation where you can never see them again. But as other panel members have said, there are people who fly a lot, and that's what needs to be reduced, the people who fly regularly. West Berkshire Council currently have a policy which they implemented, I think, in 2014, supporting airport expansion, and they reaffirmed that last July, and the motion said, we support airport expansion because we will get all of the benefits in West Berkshire and none of the downsides. And I think that's an incredibly cynical thing to commit to paper and agree as a council that other people can have their homes demolished and suffer from the air pollution whilst we get the benefits. And also, now that we've declared a climate emergency at West Berkshire Council, we've committed to go carbon neutral by 2030. I don't think it's compatible with that ambition to support Heathrow expansion. We need to have compatible policies ultimately. And I think it just exposes the fact that the council are not serious about reducing carbon by 2030 if they then, a few weeks later, support Heathrow expansion. And just to mention, it's full council this coming Thursday evening down in Newbury, and we will be holding a protest at 6:15 outside the council chamber about Heathrow, because that motion is going back yet again to that meeting. So if you are able to make it, do come along. We'll have student climate activists, Extinction Rebellion, people from all the political parties who are opposed to Heathrow expansion. So please do join us if you get a chance. Thank you.
I do take Richard's points, but I think those discussions need to be taken place, need to take place in the development of this transitional period, this transformation period. But I don't see anything Richard said means that we need to have an expansion of Heathrow. And I think Sir Brian's points are very clear. I mean, I've never supported him. I think there's no justification for Heathrow expansion. Sorry, because he's okay, basically, you don't have to support the expansion of Heathrow to accept Richard's points about the need for flying for business and so on and so on. I think we need to de-intensify flying and so on, but I never supported the expansion of Heathrow, and I think Sir Brian's points about why it shouldn't expand are pretty clear, so not for me.
So thank you. I mean, I've been looking, one of my responsibilities as leader of Thatcham Town Council is to develop a carbon plan for the town. So one of the things I've been looking into is just what is people's individual carbon footprint. And I was astounded when I was looking at aviation, because on average, a citizen in West Berkshire's carbon footprint is around about 6 tonnes of carbon dioxide. If you take just one flight, one long-haul flight, even not a very long-haul flight to the other side of the Atlantic, that's about 2 tonnes of CO2. If you go to Australia, it's about 6 tonnes of CO2. So we heard earlier from Brian in the church in his presentation that by 2050 we need to get to a level of about 2 tonnes of CO2 per person. Well, if you're going to do long-haul flight, then what are you going to do for the rest of the year? Because that's your limit of your CO2. So very interesting discussion in the panel. Does anybody else want to have any follow-up on this? Otherwise, I'll move to another question. Any more questions on Heathrow? Okay, fine. So one of the questions that came, actually multiple times, was a bit of an appeal to the panel to help us as residents. And the question is, what is the main thing that a household could do that would make the most significant difference to climate change? So Ken's got his hand up first.
Wear a jumper.
I have to say, I did encourage the panel to have short answers, so I think that takes the prize so far. Can you beat that?
Well, I'll follow on from that because we all wear jumpers, and the reason we wear jumpers is in 2011, when my 8-year-old was born, our boiler broke. We haven't had any central heating since then, and we have one little fire for our living room, which I can't remember the last time we switched on. And we live in a 1960s house, and it isn't well insulated at all. We live perfectly fine without our heating. My challenge to you all is switch your heating off. You do not need it. And I am medically, I am counted as needing my heating because of health issues, and yet I manage without because I'm sensible with what I wear and how we live.
The answer is come to GreenFest. My head is fizzing with stats. Here's one. In a month of all the new clothes that we're buying in this country, I've just heard this from Victoria. Have you heard an amazing talk? In a month, all the new clothes is the equivalent of flying 900 times around the world in terms of the carbon it's emitting. If you're wearing a T-shirt and it's not sustainably produced like those amazing girls in the by the shop are producing, it takes 800 litres of water to produce every T-shirt. So let's look at what we're doing and what we're buying. There is also, over there, they're probably here somewhere, an organisation that will get 10 of you in a street to work together and have really cheap photoelectric cells on your roof. You'll be able to get West Berkshire Council rolling out their electric vehicle charging points, and so you will be able to make that transport loop yourself, because not only will you be energising your house from a renewable source, but you'll also be able to store some of it in a battery, and you'll be able to charge your electric vehicle. You know, this is really going to make a difference if we can make it cheap and easy, and people are doing this and they're doing it elsewhere. Why can't they do it in West Berkshire?
Yes, well, we've actually produced a little booklet which says what you can do, 9 things you can do. And I have a pile of them here. I gave out half at the church, but I've still got some here. Number 1 of those is actually make your voice heard. Tell people, everyone you can get hold of, that you think this is important. But then in your everything you do, you should actually think of your environmental footprint of that activity. It doesn't mean you don't do it, but if you have a choice between a refrigerator that's A+ and one that's A++, it doesn't matter what the cabinet looked like, you go for the A++. Your next car should definitely be not the one that goes 0 to 60 in the fastest time, but actually the one with the lowest environmental impact. So everything you do, your house, I think rather than this jumper, I'd rather make sure my house is properly insulated. That would be my first act. And I think my wife's sitting there, and she objects when she's wearing 2 jumpers, let alone 3. And so insulating that house, and if there's a new house, that new house should be just about carbon neutral. And so the people in that house should be able to sit in a t-shirt. It shouldn't be a question of how many sweaters they wear. So we've just got to change the situation so we can live what is really a very good life. It's not a hair shirt life. It's actually living a life that's different, but it's actually better.
One thing I don't think we've mentioned so far is becoming vegan, because obviously meat has a very high carbon footprint. I tried to become vegan about 25 years ago, and it was awful. I thought I was going to starve to death because the options were just so hideous. So I just stayed a vegetarian. But I have become sort of 95% vegan in the last year. I do stray sometimes, but I figure 95% is better than nothing. And it is a lot easier now. You might have heard of the campaign called Veganuary. So every January they encourage people to become vegan. And a lot of the restaurants in Newbury were serving up great stuff, and they've carried on doing that. So I would encourage that. It's much, much easier to do it now than it used to be. You know, you can buy milk that tastes just as good as dairy milk. The stuff we used to have years ago was disgusting. So if you haven't tried it, I would really recommend it, definitely.
Could I just say, one says eat less meat and dairy. So that's the way to start. And that's not difficult. Just eat less of it.
Can I just add one thing? Neighbourhood plans are amazing, and every community can do this. In one village, Blueberry, outside my constituency, they took an infrared photograph of every house, and they gave that in the middle of winter, and they gave that to every householder and left it up to them to make. They could see which window, which door, which part of the roof was pumping out heat into the atmosphere. And then they were in control. They could say, right, I'm going to get a new door, I'm going to improve the windows, I'm going to insulate my roof. And I think that, giving people knowledge is power.
I'm going to talk at 2:15 about why it's not necessary to go vegan, and about the other stuff. So just wanted to say that. In terms of what we do, we have to move to a new level, and it's been very interesting. Clothes. So first of all, less stuff. Very important. Less stuff of all types. Clothes change. We're really going to look at that, and make a noise. And continue, make more noise, because actually my biggest problem living in West Berkshire is the lack of transport. So I'm forced to drive a car. Where I live in Lambourne, public services are garbage, basically. And if I want to go to the station, to go to London, get on a train, I have to use a car to get to the station. And this is a real problem in terms of de-intensifying that activity and that travel activity. So I have to make a noise with West Berkshire about more public services, more public transport.
Parliament, in its wisdom, passed an act which said we've got to reduce our energy use by 80% by 2050. Now, for each householder to do that, it would, on average, cost £30,000 to £40,000. I know because I've designed 3 houses, 70s houses, to save 80% of their fuel bills, and 10 years ago it cost £30,000 to £40,000 to do this. People cannot afford £30,000 to £40,000 to spend on a house which they might only live in for 5 years. So it's up to government to facilitate that and find a way to allow people to insulate their houses. There are 25 million houses in the country. If we were to do that, if we were to insulate all those by 80% by 2050, that means we've got to insulate 800,000 houses a year, every year from now to 2050. That's a massive task. We can't even produce the insulation to do it at the moment. We haven't got the professional people to design the work, and the work needs designing. You can't just leave it up to a builder to come in and insulate your house, because the fine detail is what makes the big difference. So you've got to design it. That work's got to be supervised. Someone mentioned the SAP, Standard Assessment Procedure, earlier on. The SAP ratings at the moment are about half what they should be, but the actual in-place performance of those houses is absolutely abysmal, because the operatives don't know what they're doing. The operatives putting insulation in don't know what they're doing. A lot of cases, the architects designing the houses don't know what they're doing. So we need a massive training program, and that will not come in time through market forces.
Thank you very much. I think there's quite a lot of for reflection there. Just picking up on Richard's point, actually, he touched on something which is to do with solar photovoltaics. That's a community initiative by West Berkshire Climate Action Network. I don't know if anybody's in the committee here, but if you're interested in attending, Vanessa, if you're interested in that scheme, please reach out to the community, Vanessa, or myself as the leader of the Town Council. I can see Martin Coulson, who's the leader of Newbury Town Council. So we're doing what we can to help support that initiative as well. So please, it's a great initiative. It's going to reduce the cost of solar panels going onto houses. I'd like to open up now to the panel, to the audience. This microphone won't go very far, so can you either shout loud or come to the front and use the microphone, please? Thank you.
Thank you. You guys have talked about the network just now and solar panels. Why have X number of houses just been built in Thatcham behind the garden centre with no solar panels on them? Why are we still building new houses? When are the planning department going to catch up with what the voters want?
Great question. Who likes to take that?
It's very easy to bolt solar panels onto a building after it's been built. It can be done quite cheaply, quite easily. It's very expensive to increase the insulation value of a building. We need to be increasing the insulation value of the buildings as they're built, not putting solar panels on. If there's a conflict on cost, we need to be insulating them first. Fabric always comes first.
Why not do both?
Yeah, I agree with you. But if it's one or the other, we've got to insulate them.
Another stat I learned today, average house to put on solar photovoltaic cells was 14,000. It's now about 8,000, and I think it's going to drop, they think, in the coming years to about 3,000 per house. It's starting to become much more affordable. So that is the market. Early adopters usually pay more on renewables. As the R&D kicks in, you start getting cheaper, better systems. And that is the way forward. The question I would also throw back is we shouldn't build any blocks of flats or any groups of houses without factoring in EV points. we've got a date in this country now where we're going to get rid of diesel cars, or you're not going to be able to buy a new diesel car. Going to be electric vehicles. We need to be building up that infrastructure. There's a huge investment going in on this. Local authorities are doing it, this local authority is doing it, and nationally there are incentives. It's going to change the way our grid functions, and but we've got to do it, and we've got to prepare for it early.
Yeah, Ken and I have both mentioned about these so-called SAP ratings. I know I spoke to councillors in Stroud, and they've imposed a percentage of 86% there. And I know some councils are resistant to those sort of measures because they say they won't get it past the planning inspectors. Their planning applications will be rejected, and then that costs them a load of money. But I mean, one of the great things about being a Green councillor is we've been able to talk to Green councillors in other councils around the country, because I'm no expert in planning, but I'm now on the planning committee, and we don't get a lot of training. So it's very much about networking and finding out what other councils are doing, looking at our own building regulations and saying, okay, what can we do here which would be better? And often you get a lot of pushback from planners saying, no, it won't work, we won't get away with it, the planning inspectors will overturn it. So it's a constant effort to sort of educate oneself about what other councils are doing and what we can do better here. And that's going to be an ongoing process for me because we don't get any training. So another thing I would say, when I've been out on the doorstep, I've met several people locally who are involved in sustainable energy projects and photovoltaics and everything. If you are local and you can give me any information and share information and advice with me, I'd be very grateful for that, because it's all useful.
Okay, thank you. Any other questions, please? Any completely different topics you want to bring up?
Listening to the conversations today has made me feel quite optimistic about what we can do and what we're doing in this country to address this problem. But my worry is what's happening in the rest of the world and the developing world that doesn't have the benefits of the last 100 years of expansion that the West has had. Are there any grounds for optimism about what can be done to help those countries develop while have less of a negative impact on the environment?
Yes, I mean, they don't have the benefit of what we've been through, but they actually have the advantage that they don't have all this old stuff, fossil fuel stuff that we have. So if you take Africa, then clearly the energy that should be used there is actually renewable energy generated in the village without all this big power station and the lines going down. And that is the obvious way forward for them. They can leapfrog what we've done into the new world, whereas we have to drag some of the old with us. But of course they'll need help doing this. And that's where the richer world comes in, is to help them do that leapfrogging. Now there may be advantages to the industries of those countries if our renewable energy industry is able to take part in that, but the richer world has to help them do it. But I think it can be optimistic.
My friend Claire Perry, who was until recently Climate Change Minister, said that she's deeply depressed when she goes to international fora and even the EU and sees how far behind us many other countries are. The fact that we've got the next COP coming here in next year is because we are a world leader in this. It's something to rejoice. It's also a really good bit of news that this is not a particularly divisive issue, and we all accept that man is responsible for a large chunk of climate change and we're going to have to tackle it. That is not the case. I've been to Washington, I go to Washington regularly. It is a completely partisan political issue there. And, you know, who's in the White House and what happens on Capitol Hill is just killing it. But if you want to be optimistic, go down to state level. Go and see what's happening in American companies. Go and see what's happening in Silicon Valley. Go and see what's happening in R&D on some globalized companies that are going to change our lives. And it is fantastic. Artificial intelligence, all these, the Internet of Things, these are being generated while politicians in some countries are either blind to what's going on or actively oppose it. Underneath it all, real human beings in the course of the communities they exist in, whether it's in business or in their cities. And cities are really the key to turning this round. And the first person who drew my attention to this, it was Brian when he gave us a lecture on climate at the Royal Society. There is real reason for optimism, and I think that comes back to what I said right at the beginning, in carrying people with us. If we tell them that we're all going to hell in a handcart and everything is awful and we're all going to die and we've trashed this world, well, that is part of the message. But I think that the optimistic message is one that we have to bracket around that, because we have to make sure people understand that it is worth them changing what they do, and it is worth them really paying a price in their private lives at times for tackling this, because we can and we will achieve it.
I think Richard will agree that we're one of the few countries in the world which meets the, I think it's the UN obligation to spend 0.7% of our GDP on aid, and I think we should be proud of that. But I think we need to spend a bit more, or we will have to spend a bit more in the future.
Can I just take that? The trouble is we're using quite a lot of that in fossil fuel in the developing world, and what we need to do is make sure it's used for these new renewables.
We've just massively increased the proportion of what aid we're producing, to answer that question as well, in helping other countries decarbonise. I can't remember, hundreds of millions of pounds now being spent to help other countries go down the path that we have started to go down.
Do you think we could just get it right here first before we start spending money on everybody else? So I used to work in Africa. I used to fly there every 2 weeks, and I worked there for every 2 weeks at a time for 3 years. And I can tell you there is some phenomenal infrastructure going in Africa, all paid for by the Chinese. If you look at what the Chinese are doing in Africa, they are connecting mines to ports everywhere, roads everywhere, investing in villages so that they can basically get the resources they want out of the villages they want as quickly as possible to the ports. You go down these, they make the M25 look like an A road, okay? Let's not kid ourselves here. We can listen to politicians and we can listen to all the nonsense, okay? But you need to make your minds up what you do in your backyard that benefits your community, and make that a sustainable community first. Because you'd be surprised by some of the developing countries, one, how evolved their infrastructure is, two, how evolved they are with either their techniques, their engineering, their use of resources, how they recycle and renew. The countries that we really need to help jump on the bandwagon, we're helping already. For example, the work that we're doing in India, where we're transferring techniques from this country to there. I've recently done some work in South Korea. Again, it's a UKR initiative where we're looking at cross-pollination, whatever the latest buzzword is, of technologies across. So between mass population to engineering technologies that we have. But we have to fix this in our back door. I mean, we're talking about electric vehicles. I can tell you a million things about electric vehicles, and I can tell you don't go and buy one. Okay, and that's what I do for a living. I have quit my job to try and be more sustainable in my own life. Okay, so we can all fluff it up and we can put spin on everything, but the reality is what you are doing here today, attending here, listen to the people around you. There's some amazing things are obviously happening at a parish and a town and a local level. Embrace those and run with it. We can look with rose-tinted glasses on at the way that our grandparents lived when everyone's garden grew. My granddad did epic tomatoes, but green bean. Yeah, everyone was more sustainable than we are now. Okay, so we need to worry about our own country. We should start taxing more. We're talking about taxing sugar for obesity. We tax smokers. We tax drinkers. Let's tax the people who make plastics. Yeah?
Yeah, I'm sorry, I may have misunderstood you. Are you saying that we shouldn't be spending some of our overseas development money encouraging and helping countries that don't have the means to do it with the technology they need to? I was a trade envoy in 3 countries in Africa. I've seen what China has done. Some of it is very, very good, and a lot of it is not at all environmentally friendly and or societally kind. But there is, yes, you're right. Of course, there is more that we can be doing in this country, but I absolutely reject the idea that we should not be helping other countries do what is needed to be done to tackle this problem, because it is a global problem.
Okay, so great comments there. Can I just move the conversation along, if you don't mind? See if there's any other questions from the audience. There's a lot of people here. Please stick your hand up if you've got a question. Yep. I don't think this microphone quite reaches, so be careful.
I think we'd all agree that in terms of cutting carbon emissions, the UK is a world leader, but I kind of feel that's been very easy for the average person in the street to see along, because it's had no impact on our lives. But I think some of the things we have to do now do have an impact on our lives, and the nature of politics in this country means that the government is always looking for popular policies. So how do we sort of square that conundrum there, that we have to start bringing some unpopular policies?
Yeah, and if I can just build on that a little bit, I mean, we have made huge advances, or huge, I mean, we heard from earlier from Brian, 60% of our electricity grid, the carbon intensity has been reduced by 60%. So we have done some good things, but we haven't done anything in the difficult things like building regulations, heating, transport, aviation. None of this has actually budged at all. And a lot of the carbon reductions to do with power generation comes because we phased out old coal power stations, and that wasn't actually due to climate change policy directly, or Brian might correct me. It was due as much as anything to do with air quality emissions, nitrogen oxide and sulfur dioxide, and they were regulations imposed by the European Union. So, you know, consequence of that is that we phased out our coal. We improved our CO2 performance for our electricity grid, but now we've got the real hard stuff to do. We've got to address the transport, the housing, and things that will actually really hit people's lifestyles differently. So yeah, it's a great question. Let's see what the panel says.
Yeah, most of us have got our lofts insulated. Most of us have got our cavity walls insulated. We've got double glazing. In order to go to the next step, you need to externally insulate your already insulated house. It's the only way we can get anywhere near the performance that's required. We've got to go to triple glazing rather than double glazing. We've got to go to completely sealed houses with air management systems to input air through a heat exchanger, so the outgoing air, or the heat from the outgoing air, is brought back into the house again. And all this costs an awful lot of money, and it's beyond the abilities of most people to pay. The government found £400 billion to bail out bankers. Well, if they put £10 billion a year for 5 or 10 years into a new Green Deal with no interest rate, that would enable people to go out and start doing this extra work, which is essential to get the energy use in the house down by the amount required.
The phase out of coal in generation was an announcement that followed the Paris Climate Agreement, and it was very much a climate issue, and one of the first, we are, I think, the first industrialised economy to make that commitment. As we're sitting in the Berkshire Downs, I think we should also talk about the contribution agriculture can and should make to reducing our dependency on greenhouse gas emissions. I'm from a farming family. We've carried out a natural capital audit of our farm, and we're looking at ways in which we can improve, particularly in areas of biodiversity. But the big win for agriculture is by using soil differently, locking up carbon in soil. And be wary of those who say the future is veganism, because actually what you want in this landscape around us is more grass. And you want fewer ploughs and cultivators going through the fields and growing crops. And in order to have more grass, you've got to have something to eat that grass. So if everybody became vegan and we got rid of, and farmers were ploughing much more land that is currently grass, you would have a result that you might not want. I'm adopting something called the 4 parts per thousand, which came out of the French response to the Paris Accord, and that is about doubling the organic matter in your soil, and that is done through grass as part of a rotation.
I agree that it's been easy up to now. The government have, in the electricity supply, then the easy decisions have been made and they've worked. From now on, they're going to be more tricky, but that's not true in some areas. I'm going to go back to the new housing. Government just has to actually put in the regulation there, that will happen, and the houses won't cost much more. The land, the prices, the cost of the houses in the land, and that increment in the building won't change much. And again, in transport, it wouldn't make much difference if it was made much easier for everyone to go for an electric vehicle sooner rather than 2040. It can happen in the next few years. So there's some easy things again. There's low-hanging fruit still, but some of it will be a little bit more difficult, and there may be slight lifestyle changes in order to handle those. But I think if everyone can see why things are happening and that the easy things are being done and that the different ways of doing things are just as good, I don't think it's a problem.
Just quickly, I mean, Richard made the point about grass. I think one thing that we could do is to plant more trees. And I know the Woodland Trust, who've got a stall here, are encouraging people to do that. We're going to plant a community orchard soon in East Ilsley, the village that I live in. And we had a very good talk from a guy earlier who talked about other community orchards that he set up. So we really need to think about planting more trees. I think the trouble with a lot of these answers is you do one thing and it has a knock-on effect. So Richard says about grass, and you need cattle to eat the grass. Well, cattle is one of the biggest carbon outputs in the world. So I think, you know, we should try and do a bit of everything ultimately. I don't think we should reject veganism. I think we could all do more by eating less meat. You know, we don't have to be 100% vegan, but I think there is a danger with all of these things that we get confused and we think, well, we don't really know which option we can take, and everything's not a good option, so, you know, what do we actually do? So I think we just need to do as much as we can as individuals.
If you eat beef, eat Berkshire bred, grass-fed beef.
As a beef farmer who grazes Greenham Common, I'm quite happy to say we should eat less beef, but it's got to be properly produced grazed beef, not intensive beef.
Can I just do a couple of points there? Transport, just give us a bus. You know, public transport first and foremost. We have to have 2 cars as a family because we physically, where we live, cannot get anywhere by bus. Secondly, if you want to eat good food, aquaponics. Grow food communally. Aquaponics is the growth of plant matter using fish to provide the nutrients through the fish poo. Fish do not add to the carbon, to CO2, because when you're keeping them in the ponds and you grow the algae actually absorbs more CO2 than any other method, far more than grass. Please, let's grow more algae. And fish, you don't have to eat the fish, you can be a vegan and you can grow aquaponically because you can provide the fish with a wonderful environment, and aquaponics grows food 4 times faster than any other method. And it is driving around the bend that across the country we are knocking down old greenhouses to provide parking. There was one knocked down in Brighton a couple of weeks ago to provide a car park. That was a communal food resource, and it's now a car park. If we're going to get any of this right, we've got to start here, and we've got to grow our own food locally.
I think there's just one overall arching theme for all of this, which is just consume less. Buy less, consume less. Turn the heating on less, drive less, walk more, buy locally. Yeah? It's not about whether you want to be a vegan, wear hemp shirts, you know, burn your bra, whatever it is. This is just about consuming less. There's a really horrible fact that I learnt a couple of weeks ago, which is we are physically consuming, as in eating, a credit card size worth of plastic every week. And that is through the air, through extreme microplastics, through our food and our water, which is not getting caught by filtration. Equate that probably eventually to things like cancer, illnesses, you know, bowel and digestive disorders, all right? Just stop consuming. That's all we have to do. Start at the very beginning. Swap, share, talk. I got some jam delivered yesterday. Get some jam from someone who came to pick some blackberries in my garden. All right? None of this is new. We all have to go back to forming a community. You know, the digital revolution, which, you know, my industry is a big part of, you know, Internet of Things, electric vehicles. If anyone wants to talk about electric vehicles, I'm more than happy to. We are over consuming in every single thing that we do. Electric vehicles are not the answer, okay? Being vegan, sadly, is not the answer, right? Flying less is not the answer. It's everybody consuming less.
Well, actually, there's a good place to end, I think. Anyway, the vegan, the beef, the aquaponics, wherever, 2:15, we can talk about all of that. Because I disagree with everything you said and agree at the same time. Agree and disagree, because it's complex. It's complex. Actually, the answer is not complicated. The situation's complex. The answer is quite simple, which is partially consuming less. But to come back to your point about we're going to the difficult things, how do you communicate? How do we get that across? And I think that is communication. And it's also about positive messages without hiding the negative stuff and the difficulties. Everywhere around the world, there's some great projects, really making change, really innovative, whether it's in farming, water management, energy, or whatever. But unfortunately, the innovative projects tend to exist in a hostile economic environment and a hostile policy and political environment. So we have to talk about the positives, and we have to create networks of positive action and start to get that across. But in order to deal with these things that are no longer low-hanging fruit, we need better communication about the problem. And critically, we need equity. We have to have fairness in all solutions and how we apply them. It is no good having elites jetting around the world in private jets coming up with explanations about security as to why they have to do it, and the rest of us saying, having to queue or saying we're giving up flying. It's no good having one set of bailout criteria for the banks and not making the necessary investments into the kind of infrastructure that we need. We've got to move away from the idea that business and the market is going to provide the answer. Business and the market can provide innovation, but we also have to have proper regulation and proper taxation to deal with that. And to get the regulation and the taxation means we have to communicate with voters who actually find these things difficult. And the message to do that, how to do that, is not to hide stuff, is to speak about positive things, but also to be fair about how we apply all of these things. Equity is important in change.
Okay. So, unfortunately, we are out of time. I can see, just before I wrap up, I just want to say one thing. I can see that Brian's just pulled out his little brochure here. And I have to say, this is a great little brochure because it just summarises 9 things that you can do individually to try to reduce your carbon footprint and the impact that you have. And it just wraps up perfectly what Sally was saying. You know, a lot of it is about common sense. It's about less consumerism. It's about, you know, do I really have to fly? Do I really have to drive the car that journey? Or can I double up with somebody else or do 2 things on that journey? Just think through everything you're doing, everything that has a significant carbon impact, and do less of it. That's a starting point. So can I thank everybody in the panel, because I thought it was a great discussion. Apologies, I had loads of questions from people in advance. If they weren't asked, then we just ran out of time. But a big round of applause, please, for the panel. And enjoy the rest of the day. I'm not too sure what's going on here next. I'm looking across. Is it you? Okay, brilliant. So if you stick around, you can